By 1854, Isambard Kingdom Brunel had already changed the world. Brunel was a civil engineer by trade, but more importantly, a visionary who seemingly made it a point to work outside of the metaphorical box. In the world of shipbuilding alone, he already had two revolutionary accomplishments under his belt. The Great Western, the first steamship constructed for the purpose of transatlantic passenger service, and the Great Britain, the first screw-driven and first iron passenger ship to cross the Atlantic. Had he stopped there, he would have already secured his place in the history books. But Brunel was an ambitious man who envisioned an efficient transportation network to connect the world that would not be actualized for quite some time and long after his death. Like the ship that is the subject of this video, Brunel was a man ahead of his time. This video, though, is not about Brunel specifically, but rather about his last great project, and perhaps his most ambitious, the SS Great Eastern, or as he affectionately called it, his Great Babe. After consulting with naval architect John Scott Russell, Brunel approached the Eastern Steam Navigation Company with a proposal to build a steamship of unthinkable proportions, which would be able to sail from England to Australia without refueling. After all, stopping to refuel took a lot of time and made long journeys inefficient. The ship would also be able to take advantage of economies of scale because such a large ship would be able to carry many more passengers than any passenger ships of the day. The proposal was accepted and construction began in 1854 at John Scott Russell's shipyard in Newall. The Great Eastern was nearly 700 feet long with more than an 80-foot beam. She would be almost 19,000 gross register tons, making her the largest ship in the world by leaps and bounds. Not only that, she would remain the largest ship in the world by this metric for decades to come, until White Star Line's Celtic was completed in 1901, nearly 50 years later, which is incredible given the explosion in naval technology occurring during this time. But the Great Eastern was revolutionary for more than just her size. She also featured a double skin, something that would eventually become standard for large passenger ships, but was new at the time. This would allow the ship to survive certain types of accidents, which would otherwise cause her to sink, including accidents like Titanic's sideswiping of an iceberg 60 years later. The ship would have three methods of propulsion: sail, paddle wheel, and screw propeller. The screw and paddle wheels would be powered by two separate sets of engines, and the sails would be employed when practical. All of this required the ship to have 5 funnels, 6 masts, and 2 60-foot paddle wheel casings. Interestingly, Great Eastern was the only commercial ship in history to have 5 functional funnels. These propulsion systems would provide 8,000 horsepower and allow the ship to cruise at 14 knots. The launch of Great Eastern was scheduled, and 10,000 people showed up, 3,000 of them having paid for admission to the actual shipyard to see the launch. The largest ship in the world, though, got stuck halfway through the launch and wouldn't budge. The launch was called off. Over the next 2 months, several attempts were made to launch the ship, until the public was tired of the wait and disappointment, and eventually stopped showing up. The ship was eventually launched, of course, but at great expense and prolonged embarrassment. The misfortunes of the Great Eastern were only getting started, though. The company which originally commissioned her, the Eastern Steam Navigation Company, went broke during the fitting out and preparation phase. This foreshadowed the commercial future of the ship, but for now, the project was taken over by a new company called the Great Ship Company. The new company planned to use her for the transatlantic route, rather than the India and Australia route she was designed for. More on this later. But instead of New York as the western terminus of the route, the company planned on using Portland, Maine, the closest American city to England, as the destination. This plan too was eventually abandoned, and the Great Eastern was destined for the Liverpool to New York route like so many other ships. After the ship's launch, but prior to her proper maiden voyage, when she was hosting a collection of dignitaries interested in marine technology, the forward funnel shot off in a burst of steam, sending debris raining down around the deck. Not long after hearing of this incident, Brunel suffered a stroke and passed away soon after. The thought being that this incident, combined with all the stress his great babe caused him, were what caused his fatal stroke. Of course, we can't know this for sure. Although the proper repairs were made, this incident, unsurprisingly, caused most of the passengers booked on the maiden voyage to cancel. So the maiden voyage ended up carrying just 38 passengers, as opposed to the 4,000 passengers Great Eastern was designed to carry. The accommodations on Great Eastern were luxurious for the time. Cabins were about twice the size of cabins on contemporary ships, and each one had a private wash basin, many even having private baths, which would have been the height of ocean-going luxury at the time. Of course, the handful of people on board this mammoth ship for the maiden voyage had limitless space, but even if the ship had been fully booked, the passengers would have enjoyed the large, opulent public rooms and incomparably spacious promenade deck. The beam of the ship was such that, despite all the machinery and rigging necessary on a working ship powered by both steam and sail, allowed for leisurely strolls, joyous deck games, and comfortable relaxation. The decks were even described as being as wide as boulevards. In fact, the maiden voyage of the Great Eastern was arguably the point of origin of deck games as we know them today. Comfortable on paper as she may have been, the Great Eastern's performance as an ocean-going ship often ensured that her passengers would not be able to enjoy the spacious and luxurious accommodations. The Great Eastern rolled ponderously in the waves and made her passengers feel as uncomfortable as the ship herself apparently was. As she did in so many other ways, Great Eastern bit off more than she could chew. She tried to bring plentiful space and luxury to sea, but she was not fully prepared for sea herself, and her stability did not match her size. A lot of ships rolled in the sea and were successful nonetheless, but in September 1861, the Great Eastern's reputation as a ship was destroyed by a storm she encountered a few days into a westbound Atlantic crossing. The storm destroyed part of the ship's superstructure, allowing a cow which the ship had been carrying to escape and eventually crash through the skylight and fall to its death. Still, the worst was yet to come. The port paddle wheel was destroyed, and the captain had to turn the bow into the wind to try to ride out the storm, which proceeded to smash and break loose the lifeboats and nearly tossed a man and a boy off the ship when they tried to intervene. The sea struck the stern of the ship, breaking the rudder and further crippling the ship. Below, the passengers cowered in fear as the ship's furnishings thrashed about. Finally, the second paddle wheel was disabled. With the jib and trysail torn to shreds, the crew could hardly do anything more than the petrified passengers. Even though nothing could be done, the captain remained at the helm, so as not to raise alarm among the passengers. A great example of leadership. The Great Eastern continued like this for more than a day. At one point, there was a rumor on board that water was overtaking the pumps, meaning that eventually the ship would fill with water and sink. Although the ship was taking on water, thankfully the pumps were in fact keeping up with it. Finally, a passenger who happened to be an engineer offered up a solution, which the captain reluctantly accepted. The suggestion was to try to replace the 10-inch rudder pin to get the rudder under control. To do this, a passenger was roped down over the stern, plunging up and down, even into the water. Eventually, he was able to replace the pin, and the rudder was under control, meaning that the propeller could be used once again. Soon after, the Great Eastern happened upon a brig from Halifax named Magnet. Although there was little that this small sailing ship could do to assist, she agreed to stay with the Great Eastern for the night in case there was a problem. A week after first encountering the storm, which all but destroyed her, Great Eastern limped into Queenstown. The Great Eastern herself may have survived the ordeal by the skin of her teeth, but her reputation was damaged, which only served to limit her future as a commercial ship even further. Great Eastern did continue to cross the Atlantic with the new western terminus of Flushing, New York, which was situated on Long Island but very close to New York City. She did so, however, consistently underbooked. The ship was designed to carry 4,000 passengers, but she always seemed to sail with passenger numbers in the hundreds. This may have been a pleasure for the few passengers who were on board, but it did her owners no good. Great Eastern was already a very inefficient ship, prone to technical problems, and operating with most of her berths empty only made her more of a liability. She continued in this capacity, losing money, for a few more years until she was commissioned to carry out a very important task. This task would perhaps be the only truly successful enterprise of the ambitious Great Eastern. For the next couple of years, she would be operated as a cable ship, laying the second and third transatlantic telegraph cables. The first having been laid about 10 years earlier, only lasted for a short time. This was a remarkable and important accomplishment, and probably Great Eastern's most notable, aside from her rebellious design. Isambard Kingdom Brunel's friend, W. L. Lindsay, told Brunel one day while Great Eastern was under construction, quote, "You're premature. The world hasn't grown up to her. Turn her into a show, Brunel. Something to attract the masses." Although Brunel was no longer around to witness it, Lindsay's prescription turned out to be a prophecy, which Great Eastern could not escape. She ended up semi-permanently tied up in Manhattan as an attraction. For $1, you could board the ship and spend as much time as you wanted exploring all the nooks and crannies on board. Vendors and showmen set up shop near the ship, and it all became a popular attraction for people. But by the end of the summer, this rather degrading moment in her life was over, and the Great Eastern left New York to cross the Atlantic back to England. After arriving in Liverpool, though, she was moored in the River Mersey for possibly a more degrading role. She was never again to be used as a ship, but rather as something resembling a floating strip mall. There were attempts to use her as a palace, concert hall, and gymnasium, but she was eventually reduced to the role of a billboard, her massive hull providing ample real estate for names and slogans. And there she remained for nearly 25 years before she was finally stripped, auctioned off, and sold for scrap in 1889. In 30 years, the Great Eastern, the pride of her designer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, accomplished little more than laying the transatlantic telegraph cable. This was not to diminish Brunel. He was a revolutionary man who changed the world in other ways, but the Great Eastern is probably a blemish on his portfolio. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that the Great Eastern was never used for the role she was intended for. Remember, Brunel envisioned a ship that would be large enough to carry enough coal to travel non-stop to Australia, so as to be more efficient for her passengers. This was, in fact, the reason for her unspeakable size. Such a ship was not necessarily needed at the time for a regular transatlantic route. So, maybe Isambard Kingdom Brunel's Great Babe was not doomed to commercial failure from the start. Maybe she was just misused without the proper guidance from her creator.